As the country where the North European plain transitions into the Eurasian Hordelands, Poland will decide Russia's success in re-anchoring between the Baltic Sea and the Carpathians. The Poles realize what is at stake and have been taking steps toward a plan for several years. Poland, as Central Europe's largest industrial power and with its largest population, sees itself as the natural leader of the former Soviet satellites who joined the EU and NATO in the 1990s and 2000s. There is more than a small credence to that claim, but the crew that Poland seeks to lead is a motley one. Even after a quarter century of effort, the region's infrastructure is remarkably fractured. The Baltic states have far better links to Russia, a holdover of the Soviet era, than they do to one another or the Western European region. Romania and Bulgaria are south of the Carpathians and have but one four-lane road that links them to the rest of Europe, and only two bridges that connect them across the Danube, the second of which was only completed in 2013. Slovakia is mountainous. Hungary is really only linked to Austria, and even that connection is pinched by the Vienna Gap. Poland, somewhat ironically, has the best infrastructure linkages of the lot, but those connections are largely due to its position on the North European plain, which in turn ties it directly to both Germany and Russia, the two powers that Warsaw is most concerned about. Making matters worse, nearly all of the former satellites are dependent upon the Russians for both oil and natural gas. An alliance of the Intermarium, the countries between the Baltic and the Black Seas, simply isn't workable. Merely coordinating the actions of such disconnected geographies and heterogeneous cultures would be an endeavor attempted only out of sheer desperation. Without some far more powerful entity, say a rejuvenated European Union or an engaged United States, actively managing such a gangly alliance, the Russians would have a fairly easy time engaging and defeating each of the Intermarium states in sequence and in isolation. That is, with the possible exception of Poland. Despite Poland's largely indefensible position, and despite its potential need to defend against both Germany and Russia, the Poles have a Swedish ace up their sleeve. Since being forced into strategic neutrality at the conclusion of the Great Northern War of 1700 to 1721, Sweden gradually became Europe's forgotten power. While technically a continental power, Sweden boasts water to its south and east, mountains to its west, and taiga and tundra to its north. By most definitions, Sweden operates as a naval power rather than a land power, and as such its military and economic strategies emphasize speed and reach. But they do so in a manner somewhat different from other naval powers. Oceanic-oriented cultures like England and Japan were made famous because they became experts harnessing the wind to cover vast distances over open seas. Their vessels were notable for their relatively small crews, the wind did most of the work, and relatively large cargo areas. Lots of supplies were needed to keep the crew alive on long voyages, and lots of trade goods were needed to justify the trip in the first place. With large, manpower-light vessels, the British needed to interact with the locals right on the coast. They could rarely afford to penetrate inland with the men they brought, and any such excursion would have to occur on foot. Their boats, whose propulsion was limited by the whim of the wind and the depth of the water, could not easily or reliably sail on rivers. The result was an empire built on indirect rule and coastal trading depots. Early Sweden's approach was considerably different, because Sweden's regional geography was considerably different. The Danish island of Zealand kept the Swedish Vikings and later the Swedish Empire locked in the Baltic, a very small place compared with the oceans. There was no need for the Swedes to learn to sail when they could simply row. Instead of huge, wind-powered vessels with small crews, the Swedes used small, oar-powered vessels with large crews. The more men, the faster the vessel could go. Short trips meant less need for supplies. Whereas the British made landfall with small, scrawny, scurvy-ridden landing parties eager to trade, the Vikings made landfall with large, strapping warriors eager to satisfy more basic instincts. Because longboats have such shallow drafts, and because they were manned by lots of brawny Vikings, they could easily be rowed upriver and even portaged. Unique among the naval powers, the Swedes punched deep inland and even showed up as far away as Constantinople from time to time. This more direct approach is still reflected in Swedish strategy. Its military remains remarkably amphibious, and its defense industry depends upon no external power. Its economic relationships are direct and deep, seeking full ownership, in contrast to the Anglo preference of involvement via minority share purchases. But Sweden remains undeniably maritime, valuing trade and financial connections over the hardwired infrastructure and military links of land-based powers. Even now, 3 centuries after Sweden's grand defeat in the Great Northern War and its banishment to neutrality, the Baltic Sea remains a Swedish lake. Much of the world has forgotten this, but not Sweden's neighbors, because they were first raiding targets, then part of the Swedish Empire, and now part of the extended Swedish family, literally. Another culture that hasn't forgotten are the Russians, whose rivers are not particularly amenable to traditional maritime transport, but were perfect for the Viking expeditions of the previous age. The issue for the Russians and Germans isn't that Poland wants to be the brain and muscle of an anti-Russian and maybe anti-German intermarium, but that Sweden has every interest in making sure that the Poles succeed. Like Poland, the Swedes fear undue German or Russian influence regardless of the form it takes. And while Poland might have some difficulty spackling together an alliance, Sweden already has one. The familial relations of Viking and Imperial Sweden do not just include the weaklings of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, but also Finland, Norway, and Denmark, economically developed, culturally united, militarily robust countries that boast more than enough petroleum to supply everyone in the extended Swedish family, and Poland as well. By any measure, a Swedish-Polish alliance would be a mating of synergies. Sweden is an advanced maritime technocracy, while Poland is a modernizing land-based industrial power. Sweden has the money and technology needed to make Poland bloom, and Poland has the market to make it worth Sweden's while. And neither are in the Eurozone, so at least part of the European carnage to come will pass them by. Numbers will still prove a problem. There are under 10 million Swedes to support fewer than 40 million Poles against over 80 million Germans and some 140 million Russians. If Poland is to be successful, it will need more than simply Swedish help. Which brings us back to the Americans. The benefits of a Poland that can preserve its independence are undeniable. It would keep Central Europe out of either the German or Russian sphere of influence and condemn both Germany and Russia to remain locked down on local issues. Unfortunately, Poland's case and its intermarium alliance is hopeless. Keeping Poland in play would require substantial commitment of technology, treasure, and in the end, likely even blood. It is exactly the sort of commitment that the Americans will try to avoid in the new era. If the Americans are to be drawn into continental European affairs, it will be via the Swedish vector. Sweden is no pocket power. Sweden has a stable economy, a tight circle of capable allies, a top-rate military force, and uniquely in Europe, a rock-solid financial system. The trick will be to manage and bolster Poland via Sweden so that the Americans can remain one step removed from the NEP. From the American point of view, Sweden makes Poland worth a second look. Poland will need that second look because Warsaw dare not adopt a defensive strategy. It has no geographic barriers to hunker behind, and Swedish and American backing or not, it cannot possibly absorb and repel a German or Russian surge. For Poland to be independent, it has to somehow keep the competition away from its borders. The best way to do that is for the Poles to poke Ukraine as mercilessly as possible to keep the Russians off balance. Considering the Russian view of the importance of Ukraine, this is far from a low-risk operation. Should the Americans decline, the Swedes and Poles do have a fallback. Sweden nearly did not join the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons when it was negotiated in the 1960s, because Stockholm thought it would need nukes to dissuade Soviet expansionism. Its robust nuclear industry is both sophisticated and homegrown, and could construct a crude weapon in a long weekend. In this corner of the world, deterrence may not just be for superpowers.